Today, I'll introduce the Mississippian period. Mississippian dates from about AD 1000 up until the 1500s, or contact. It denotes Southeastern societies who shared similar social systems, iconographic symbols, and religion. In Mississippian societies are hierarchical and ranked, and yet kinship is still important. This kind of society is called a chiefdom. Religion and politics were mixed. In other words, Southeastern chiefdoms were theocracies. Prior to Mississippian, all societies in the Southeast were egalitarian, although some were big man. What do we mean by egalitarian? From the name, you might think that it means that everyone is equal. But there is no human society at no point in time at which everyone is equal. Instead, egalitarian means that an individual's status depends upon their age, their sex, and whether they're married or not. Thus, children were never in charge, adults were. Leadership in an egalitarian society is by individual achievement. It's not inherited. Even though it's an egalitarian society, you can still have public structures, ceremonial places, you can have leaders, shamans, and kin groups, such as clans. You would never use the words chief, elite, or commoner when talking about egalitarian societies. Chiefdoms, on the other hand, were hierarchical ranked societies, and people were born into different statuses. At the top of the society were the elite, from among whom a chief could be chosen. We use this triangle to indicate the numbers of people in each of the different statuses. At the very tippy top would be the paramount chief. Then very few people would belong to the chiefly elite class. And a little bit more, but still very few people would belong to the ruling elite class. And by far, the majority of the population at the base of the pyramid were commoners. Among themselves, commoners look egalitarian. Their status is by age, sex, and whether they're married or not. But the social rank of elite is inherited, and particularly the ruling elite and above them, the chiefly elite. So in a chiefdom, supreme leadership is inherited or ascribed. Among commoners, you may still see positions of significance gained through achievement. A chiefdom was also a territory controlled by a kin group who had risen to political religious power. Although we're not sure, we believe that the territory probably was no further than one could walk in a day in any direction. Chiefdoms were ruled by hereditary chiefs who also controlled religion. Traditionally, we've thought that chiefs were most often men who inherited their position from their uncle. However, intriguingly, in the 16th century, we find a number of Southeastern chiefdoms who were ruled by women. Southeastern chiefdoms were matrilineal, that is, inheritance passed through the female lineage. This struck Thomas Nairn, who was a South Carolina Indian agent, noted in the early 18th century, "The savages reckon all their families from the mother's side, and have not the least regard who is their father. For this reason, the chief's sister's son always succeeds, and never his own." This was obviously a new idea to somebody coming from a European background, but basically he said, it makes sense. You know who the mother is. Can you be sure who the father is? Kinship was very important in these chiefdoms, rather like living in a small town today. A chief had both rights and obligations. He could demand services, food, and other material goods from his followers, but he also was expected to demonstrate generosity in distributing food or goods as needed. His religious power kept the chiefdom safe and prosperous. A chief built a flat-top platform mound at his center, and if the leadership passed on to another family, the capital moved to their center. So capitals were not permanent in one location, but moved through time. The chief often lived on top of a platform earthen mound or close by. Sometimes a temple or a mortuary structure was built on the top of a platform mound. Platform mounds also were sometimes associated with clan groups. So you had platform mounds that were for the entire community in the larger sense, surrounding communities. Platform mounds that were really just for clan groups or kin groups and not quite so widely used. Platform mounds mark places of religious, political, and social significance. Traditionally, archaeologists have thought that if you can date when each mound was built, or even better, when each mound layer had layers added, you can somewhat trace the history of where religious political power was focused. I'd like to offer an alternative explanation to the traditional archaeological thought that mound layers were added whenever a new chief came to power, and instead propose that in an oral society like the Mississippian people were, with no written record, it was important to pass on how to do things, how to do the engineering, how to perform the correct rituals from one generation to the next, and so that you needed to resurface your mound frequently enough that that oral tradition was passed on. During state affairs, the chief was carried on a wooden litter. In everyday life, he walked around like you or I. At his funeral, his body was displayed and then buried on that same litter. It appears that many of the mounds got their start at the funeral of a chief. Mounds grew taller and bigger with later ceremonies. A chief was buried with symbolic regalia, often made using exotic, that is, not local, expensive materials. The elite, such as warriors and priests, were allowed to live near or in the mound precinct. They also could be buried there and were privileged to use certain iconographic symbols and goods in their graves. The commoners, the majority of the population, lived away from the mounds. They were buried in separate cemeteries from the elite or in their own houses. They were limited on what iconographic symbols they could put on their possessions. In chiefdoms, we find a hierarchy of places where people lived. Mound town centers. They could be either multiple mounds, such as this illustration of Cahokia, the largest mound town in North America, or a single mound center, or a town without mounds. Smaller yet would be hamlets or villages, and smallest of all would be isolated households that we call farmsteads. Mound towns have an architectural grammar. One or more mounds are placed around a plaza that has a central pole or multiple poles. Structures surround the plaza. You may build a palisade around the mound precinct. That palisade could function to keep out people. This illustration shows a palisade with bastions, that is, little towers where archers could be stationed to fend off people from entering the mound precinct. If you were to find a palisade line around a mound precinct that had no bastions, perhaps they're not trying to keep out people, perhaps they're trying to contain or protect people from the powerful spirits inside the mound precinct. Chiefdoms arose in many areas of the Southeast. This Mississippian phenomenon appears to have begun in the Mississippi Valley, and hence why we call it Mississippian. Perhaps it first appeared in the Coles Creek area of the central and lower Mississippi Valley. Its emergence is thought to have resulted both from spread from a single source of ideas, ideology, and people, that is, migration of people outward, but also we think at places developed simultaneously, of course facilitated by interaction with and knowledge of what was going on elsewhere. We believe that Cahokia in the American Bottom in the area of present-day St. Louis played a crucial role. So please watch the next in this series on Mississippian lectures in which I talk about the development of Cahokia.